For Yoga for Fertility, really what we're trying to do is support fertility, anything that's going to be fertility supporting. And a lot of the types of yoga out there are more about getting fit. I call them like yoga aerobics kind of. A lot of it, like the yoga I was doing when I went through my process, is probably too strenuous to be really fertility supporting. We are modifying poses sometimes based on where you are in your cycle.
Welcome to Baby or Bust. I'm your host, Dr. Lora Shahine, and I'm tired of infertility and miscarriage being misunderstood, hidden, and full of stigma. Welcome to the podcast with interviews and in-depth discussions on topics all things fertility. Today, we are speaking with author and certified yoga teacher and therapist Lynn Jensen about the benefits of yoga for fertility. Thank you to our friends at Seattle Sperm Bank and Greg Moga for sponsoring the show. Please take a moment to give us a 5-star review anywhere you listen to your podcast. It really helps others find the benefits that you are finding here. I am thrilled to have Lynn Jensen on the show today. Lynn founded her Seattle-based Yoga for Fertility program in 2002. Since then, she's helped thousands of people become parents. She is a registered yoga and prenatal yoga teacher, a yoga therapist, and holds a master teacher certification in energy medicine yoga. She co-authored an incredible book, Yoga and Fertility, A Journey to Health and Healing, in 2012. This was the first book devoted to the topic of yoga and fertility. She currently teaches weekly yoga and fertility classes both in studio in Seattle as well as online. That's over 25 years of helping people struggling to build their family around the world learn how to heal emotionally and physically with yoga. Lynn, I personally refer my patients to your classes almost daily, and my patients sing your praises. Your classes turn into support groups and lasting friendships and true connection, and I'm so happy to speak with you today. Thank you for being here.
And thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to be on Baby or Bust. It's really great to be here. You and I have been working together for many years already, and I really appreciate the support that you and also Pacific Northwest Fertility have given to my Yoga for Fertility classes. I think the Pacific Northwest Fertility was the first fertility clinic that listed my classes on their website to help students be able to find the classes as a resource. So that was really great. And because students have often said to me, why didn't anyone tell me about these classes like earlier in my fertility journey? Why didn't I know about these? So really great to have you referring and having the information on the website. And you were also one of the people who reviewed my book for me when it came out 10 years ago. So that was really great. And I was happy to be able to return that favor when your book came out a few years later.
Oh, thanks, Lynn. I really appreciate that. How did you get interested in yoga for fertility and turning this into your life work?
It's a great question. So, I started doing yoga many years ago when I was living in Japan, really over 30 years ago. And then I came back to go to graduate school here in Seattle, and I continued doing that yoga practice. When I came to Seattle, I looked for a teacher. And then I started a career in software. I was managing international sales and marketing for a software company for many years. And I continued my yoga practice because I just found how helpful it was with de-stressing from a really super stressful job and graduate school and all of that. I was really traveling about 60 to 70% of the time out of the country. So going in and out of time zones constantly. So yoga was kind of like a lifeline for me. I got really good at doing hotel room yoga, airport yoga, even airplane yoga.
Wow.
And then during all of that crazy, busy, stressful career, we decided to start trying to conceive. And that went on for a long time. And, in retrospect, it probably wasn't the greatest time to be trying to do that. In the end, we ended up at a fertility clinic and doing all the things. We did IUIs. We did surgery and treatment for endometriosis, which was kind of the diagnosis that I got. and we ended up doing 3 IVF cycles. The final 3 IVF cycle didn't work, and we then switched over to Plan B, which was adoption for us. That was the track we had decided to go, and in the end, it was obvious that this was the right track for us to be on because my son arrived 3 months later after 6 years of trying to conceive. We had our son in 3 months on that track. So that's just a reminder to me, and I like to say it also to my students, to keep your mind open about how you're going to be building your family because it might look very different from what you originally think.
Oh, that's beautiful.
I think for a lot of people who are dealing with fertility challenges, it already does look different from what they originally thought.
Well, and I bet your experience truly helps you connect with the people that are in your yoga classes because, treatments have changed drastically over the years, but just what an IUI is. You know what an IVF cycle is like and the shots and endometriosis, and just to be able to connect with people on a different level is really unique. Were you doing yoga throughout your treatment as well?
I did yoga really the whole time. I think I took time off probably during the stim cycles, of IVF. But, in hindsight, the yoga I was doing was pretty strenuous and probably not super supportive from a fertility standpoint. So after my son arrived and, after he turned about 2.5, when I could start to think again, I started to think about, how my yoga had impacted my fertility journey because I knew at the time when I was going through all of those treatments that it was really helping me stay on a more even keel. I had a really good friend who was going through the IVF at the same time I was, and she would come and tell me about crying in meetings at work and, yelling at her spouse. And I wasn't really having any of those kind of emotional swings during the process. And so I knew my yoga was really supporting me. But in the end, it didn't help me get pregnant. So I was thinking about what was going on with that. And maybe there should be a kind of yoga that's specifically for supporting fertility. So I started to research that. And at the time, I was already teaching yoga. I had been teaching yoga for maybe 5 or 6 years by that time. So I developed this Yoga for Fertility program that was really supportive of the things that we need to support going through the fertility process. And yes, having just done that myself, I was pretty clear about what those things should be.
What kind of resources were out there? I feel like especially your book was the first one published about yoga for fertility. So when you were trying to learn about this, what resources did you have?
Right. So, yeah, my book was really the first one that really specifically addressed yoga for fertility. There were other resources out there with like Yoga for Women where they would have a little chapter on fertility or, some comments about it using yoga for fertility. So that was the research I did primarily, was going to these other resources that had little tidbits here and there. And then just more research about understanding what's underlying fertility, hormonal balancing and things like that, and then how yoga helps with those things, and stress reduction, which is, of course, a big one.
Absolutely. Well, what's different about yoga for fertility compared to other types of yoga that, Bikram or hot yoga or hatha or
right.
vinyasa? That's actually my favorite, but it's definitely a workout for me. Yeah. What's different about yoga for fertility?
So I think the main thing is that the goals are different. It's not for yoga for fertility. Really, what we're trying to do is support fertility. Anything that's going to be fertility supporting, and a lot of the types of yoga out there are more about getting fit. I call them like yoga aerobics kind of. And really, I think some aspects of those kinds of yoga might support fertility. Like I think yoga in general works on the hormonal system because it works on the chakra system. But a lot of it, like the yoga I was doing when I went through my process, is probably too strenuous to be really fertility supporting. So when I developed the Yoga for Fertility program, I was looking at several different levels. So I was looking at physically, what do we need to support? Like, obviously, we need to support blood flow through the pelvic area and opening the pelvic area. A lot of yoga that's out there now, they're, doing a lot of abdominal work, which is instead, contracting that pelvic area rather than opening it, the energy there. More specifically working with balancing hormones, because we can work, yoga was developed to work on the chakra system. The chakra system and the endocrine system, really, if you look at them together, they line up with each other.
Yeah. Can you explain what the chakra system is to our listeners?
Sure. So chakra system in yoga is the system of energy centers in the body. And there are different numbers depending on who you talk to, but there are 7 main chakras that most people talk about. And if you look at those energy centers lined up with the endocrine system, there's at least one gland of the endocrine system in each of the chakra centers, very near to the location of it, as pictured in the yoga books.
So the poses that you're doing and the breathing that you're doing, you're trying to focus on certain areas of the body and the chakras?
Exactly. Yeah. And you can think of it either way. You can think of, okay, now we're working on the thyroid gland, or you can think of now we're working on the 5th chakra, right? Either direction.
Well, I can say the one time that I took a class with you, we did a Mother's Day class for Pacific Northwest fertility patients and just anybody that wanted to come. Mother's Day is a really hard time when you are not a mother yet. And that was a wonderful class that we did together. And I remember a lot of breathing, a lot of poses held for a longer time rather than me leaving the class feeling like drenched, in sweat and just, kind of exhausted. I left with almost more energy. And I also remember you speaking to people where they are in their treatment. Certain poses, you would sort of say this might not be great for this time in your cycle, or if you're waiting to see if you have a positive pregnancy test. And I thought that was very interesting. Are there certain poses that people should avoid or focus on at different times in their cycle?
Yeah, so that's actually a big difference in yoga for fertility versus another yoga class that you might go to, because we are modifying poses sometimes based on where you are in your cycle in my class. So my classes are super gentle, for one thing. So most of the time, everybody can do everything we're doing. But because we're trying to do different things in the first part of the cycle, the pre-ovulatory part of the cycle versus the second part of the cycle, the luteal phase, your body's trying to do something different in those 2 halves of the cycle. So if you're in the first half, then we can do things that are a little bit more stimulative. We're trying to kind of boost the ovaries during that part of the cycle. But in the second half of the cycle, anybody in my class, it's possible that we're supporting implantation. So then we want to not do quite such stimulative things. So I am often advising people, if your first half, you might do this. If your second half, maybe do this instead. If you're on your period, you might do something completely different. Yeah. Or some poses are just not great for when you're on your period. So we have different options for that.
Give me one great pose in the 2-week wait, that really tough time between ovulation or an embryo transfer or an IUI, and you're waiting to see if your period comes or if you're pregnant. That's one of the most stressful times when you're trying. So give me one pose that you recommend during that time.
The pose I mostly recommend for that time period would be legs up the wall pose, Viparita Karani, if you're a Sanskrit speaker.
Oh, sure, Lynn. Absolutely. Okay.
So it's basically just exactly what it says, legs up the wall. And it's a very calming pose for one thing, but it's also supporting the uterine lining for another thing. So keeping blood flow into the uterus. So doing that pose, and then with some good visualization, right? What you want to be happening during that time.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And that's such a relaxing pose. Anybody can do that. Even if you're tired, you can put your feet,
it's actually really good when you're tired.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Is there any research into the benefits of yoga for fertility. I certainly found some things when I looked on PubMed, just in preparation for today. I was really excited by what I saw.
Great. Well, there might be some things that I haven't seen, which you saw today. So, the one that I usually mention, just because it was really such a groundbreaking study, is Dr. Alice Domar's study of way back in 2000.
She is an amazing friend of the podcast. She was on our show in the first season doing that episode on stress and fertility. She is a dear friend. Yes.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about. But share
And
the
she's
study.
been doing this for a long time, really a pioneer in looking at the kind of mind-body connection around fertility. So her study, her groundbreaking study about this was back in 2000. She had a group of women who had been trying to get pregnant for like 1 to 2 years, and she broke them into 3 groups. There was a mind-body group who did things like yoga and meditation. There was a support group who met weekly and just talked about what was going on. And then there was a control group who was just going through the process as normal. And these women were all getting treatment at the clinic where Dr. Domar was working. And so in the end, the results of that, she was looking for pregnancy within 1 year. That was her checkpoint. And in the end, 20% of the control group got pregnant. 54% of the support group got pregnant, and 55% of the mind-body group got pregnant. So it was a huge jump between the control group and the mind-body group and the support group in terms of getting pregnant. The other piece of, I think, data that's interesting from that study is that from the control group, 20% conceived naturally. From the support group, 11% conceived naturally. And the mind-body group, 42% conceived naturally. So it's a pretty clear connection, right, between doing those practices and getting better results from fertility.
I love it. So, Allie, Dr. Domar, I should say, I mean, she has done so much research into it and really just shown, and it's why I have so many different support options for my patients, because I also think that everybody's a little bit different. As a doctor, I can certainly do the treatment and kind of counsel, but I can't be the therapist and the yoga teacher and the, group counselor. And so we have this really great handout, sort of a support and wellness handout, and your classes are on there.
Yay.
Yes, because there are people that are looking, they benefit from movement a little bit. And, your classes, again, turn into support networks. I feel like I don't want everyone to think like, oh my gosh, you have to do yoga in order to get pregnant. But I think it's this incredible tool to examine because it's been shown to be beneficial.
Yeah, and the other thing that I say, and I say this to my students too, when I tell them about this data, that the mind-body group did so well in this study. Their percentage was very high, but also the support group's percentage was quite high. So if we put those two things together, then we're going to be even farther above where those two groups came out. So I like to include the whole support group aspect in my classes too, because I think it's also really super important.
Yeah, I agree. And I found studies supporting yoga for improving PCOS patients, not only decreasing depression, decreasing anxiety, but also helping with glucose metabolism and decreasing lipid levels.
You have to give me the references for those studies because...
Yeah, and we'll put these in the show notes for everybody. So Ali Domar's study, the PCOS study, I found great review articles looking at improving success with fertility treatments and decreasing depression for anybody trying to conceive. So it's not only something that makes you, feel good, moving your body, but there's also evidence to really show its benefit.
Yeah, and that's interesting about the studies about PCOS and insulin resistance because, when I was talking about the chakra system and the endocrine system, I mean, with yoga, we're working on those glands. I mean, we just are because yoga is designed to do that. So helping to balance the endocrine system and, maybe working on the pancreas specifically and the spleen, which we kind of look at together from a yoga standpoint, would essentially help PCOS.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah.
When I was doing research before I started this program 20 years ago, I was doing research on the endocrine system, and I was thinking, well, for fertility support, we just pick a few of these glands. We'll support the thyroid, of course, and we'll support the ovaries, of course, and probably the adrenal glands because everybody's stressed out, and that's probably enough, And then the more research I did, I realized, no, every gland in the endocrine system has something to do with fertility, and we can't leave any of them out.
Everything's connected: mind, body, stress, fertility, reproduction. I just think it's all connected. And I think that there are a lot of alternative therapies, Eastern medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, yoga, a lot of different modalities kind of pull that concept together a lot better than Western medicine. Even though I am an MD and I am a Western-trained doctor, I just am fascinated by how both aspects can benefit people.
You've done more research on some of those topics than I think a lot of Western doctors have, even your book.
Always learning. So a lot of patients ask me about exercise during fertility treatment, especially during IVF stimulation and maybe waiting to see if they're pregnant or not, and have been told by other providers or support members to do nothing, like no exercise. And I don't counsel my patients that way. I think movement is very important for mental health and physical health, but I might talk about modifying. How do you counsel your students about exercise during treatment?
So I think definitely during the stim cycle, we back off a lot. In my classes, when someone's on their stim cycle, I'm working with them really individually to make sure that what they're doing is appropriate for where they are in their stim cycle.
And when you say stim cycle, do you mean the shots leading up to an egg retrieval?
Right.
Got
exactly. It. Mm-hmm. The rest of the IVF cycle, for most people, they can do my regular yoga for fertility classes, and we don't need to modify very many things leading up to when they start the stimulation drugs. And in the post-retrieval time, we need to be careful, of course, because their ovaries are still large, and there's concern about the torsion on the ovaries and things like that. So again, we're careful during that stretch. And then post-transfer is another time that we pay pretty close attention. For a few days post-transfer, I really advise my students to do only really relaxation poses. Legs up the wall is still good for that time, and breathing practices. And then after about the third day post-transfer, they can go back to doing what in my classes would be regular second half kind of poses. Mm-hmm. So in general, during IVF cycles, one of the things about my classes is we always do a check-in at the beginning of class. That's part of my class format. So anyone who's in my class, whether it's an online class or an in-person class, I know what's going on with them that day when they come in. So I know who needs to have things modified and what to help them with. So I'm able to do that because my classes are pretty small. I keep them to no bigger than 15 people, which is about how many cycles I can keep track of at the same time. Right. Other than those times during the treatment cycle, if someone's doing IUIs, they can basically do whatever I'm offering in my class. And I think it's important because it's the most stressful time, really, during fertility treatment. When you're giving yourself shots every day, you need support for that.
Agreed. I do tell my patients, you mentioned this, but just to clarify that as you're going through an IVF cycle and you're stimulating the ovaries to recruit multiple eggs, the ovaries do get enlarged and they are at risk of twisting on themselves. That's the ovarian torsion that you mentioned. And so I do talk to my patients about parts and ways to modify. If you are doing yoga, I wouldn't do inversions. That's what I talk to my patients about, like downward dog or, headstands or things like that, because just imagine that the ovaries could twist on themselves. Or if they're swimming, I don't want them to do like flip turns at the end of the pool, So it's like, yes, but you can still like you said, breathe, or, if they're in your class, I'm like, just do whatever Lynn says. But,
Right.
but for other people, I'm like, just, you can do stretching and take good care of yourself. Yeah.
I would say it'd be in a regular yoga class, it'd probably be pretty hard to modify during that part of the cycle. Because, twisting in yoga, that's a really common thing to do in a yoga class. And if I have somebody in my class who's on stim drugs, they're not twisting.
Yeah, I just tell people to, if you're in a class, just go to child's pose, just lie on the floor, which is what I often do when I'm exhausted.
Yeah,
I'm still doing flow.
Even child's pose, though, the other thing that I have people avoid is compression.
Okay.
So for some people, when they get in child's pose, they're compressing because they're so flexible that they can do that.
Yeah.
Even in forward bends, some people are. So we just are watching, especially twisting and compression, those things to modify for them. Yeah.
What could somebody expect from a class with you? Like, what would that look like?
So as I mentioned already, there's a big support aspect to my class, and that's intentional. I'd like to have the class feel like a unit. So my classes they're not drop-in classes. There are series classes, and usually 7 or 8 week series. Classes always start with a check-in where everybody just says what's going on with them, where they are in their cycle, anything else they want to update on. Sometimes I throw in an extra question just to kind of help people find out about each other in the class. So that's the beginning of the class. And then I usually talk about something. There's a theme for the class. Sometimes there's a theme that we use for the whole session, and I'm just building on that as we go through the session. So sometimes the themes are like this session, we've been working with the theme of how to stay on the faith path instead of the fear path as you're going through this fertility journey. And that theme actually came up because a couple people in one of my classes mentioned that they would like to work on that. So that's what we've been focusing on. And so the practices that we are doing then are kind of adapted to working with that idea of what are the things that help us stay out of that fear path, like calming breathing practices help us stay out of that fear path, for instance. We've been working now with the practice of mindfulness or just being present, which is another way to stay out of that fear mode. In yoga, we talk about the monkey mind. The monkey mind likes to run around and find all this stuff for us to worry about out in the future, what's not going to happen, out in the past, what did happen that we wish wouldn't have happened. And so we can really kind of tame that monkey mind by being present and practicing that being present, but it's very hard. That practice is challenging. So we talk about a theme, something that we're going to work into the practice, and we always do breathing practice. In my classes, that's the first thing we do generally, because it's such a powerful tool for people to use when they get stressed. Just slowing down and taking some calming breaths. And just this past week, I assigned as homework for people to now pay attention to their breath this week and just notice when it's short and choppy, and maybe what they're doing when it's short and choppy. So my students came back and a couple of them reported noticing that, wow, my breath got a lot shorter and choppier when I was looking at social media. So interesting, right? So then she started thinking maybe I should kind of limit what I'm doing here because, it's changing my breath, which is putting me into this anxiety mode.
Wow, amazing. Can you give us an example of a breathing exercise that we might be able to do together and that the listeners could do?
Sure.
Yeah.
Would you like to try one?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Yeah. So the first thing when we're breathing is always to get a long spine.
Okay.
Because that helps us be able to take the longest, deepest breaths possible. And then I like to work with this counted breath. So we're going to do an equal length inhale, equal length exhale. And starting with a 4 count, and I'll just count it.
Okay.
And if you get off of what I'm doing, just don't worry about it and keep taking long, deep inhales and long, deep exhales. Okay. But often what we find is that people truncate the inhale especially. So we're trying to just get a feel for how it would be doing this at the same speed, same rate. So starting by exhaling first, just exhale any air that's in the lungs now. Probably closing your eyes is helpful when you're breathing. And then inhale, 2, 3, 4, and pause. And exhale, 2, 3, 4, pause. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, pause. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, pause. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, pause. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, pause. One more round like that. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, pause. And exhale, 2, 3, 4, pause. And then you could continue that just at your own count. Could be the same count I was doing, could be a different count. But inhale and exhale about equal length. And then as you're ready, you could start to slowly open the eyes again. Do you feel calmer?
Yes. Now I'm going to go take a nap. It was so nice to see you.
Yes.
That was beautiful. And I've heard of box breathing, a little bit like that. Or sometimes I learned with my children, you follow your fingers on your hand. So as you trace up the pinky finger to the nail, you breathe in, and then you breathe out as you go down. And that just manually, that was wonderful because you have 5 fingers, most likely. And so 5 deep breaths, and
that's great
that
for
was
kids.
really, really good.
Gives them a way to track that. Yeah, really
I just
nice.
can't emphasize the importance of breath work. It just seems so like, oh my gosh, all you're doing is breathing. But it really seems to calm the fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system, and it kind of kicks in the calming parasympathetic.
Yeah, it definitely does that. That's one of the tools, one of the best tools, I think, for just kind of instantly taking you out of fight or flight mode is to just shift the breath to some deep breaths.
Yeah.
It's kind of programmed into the body. So if the body sees that you're taking long, deep breaths, it says, oh, no danger, not a problem, right? I can shift out of that fight or flight mode.
And decrease your cortisol levels.
Yes.
And calm your adrenal glands. And calm some chakra that I'm not aware of, but
It calms all your chakras.
That's great. Oh, Lynn, I have I reached out to my community on Instagram. It's just Dr. Lora Shahine on Instagram. And I told everybody that I was interviewing you today and asked what they would like to ask you. And I got so many responses. So many people are interested in what you're doing. It was hard to choose a couple of them. Sandy asked, is it okay to do fertility and yoga during assisted reproductive cycles like IVF? We just answered that.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say at any one time, there might be like 50% of people in my classes who are doing some part of an IVF cycle.
That's great. And you can just modify a little bit, like we talked about. Katrina asks, who are your classes for? Can people who are doing egg freezing do it? Could people who are single, or is it only couples? Is there a certain person that should come or should not come to your class?
So generally, I used to always say if you're anyone who's trying to conceive is the right person to come to my class. But for egg freezing, that's a little different because they're not trying to conceive right at this moment. However, they are going through all of these same treatments and procedures and having the same stresses as someone who's really trying to conceive right now. So I would say if you're trying to conceive or if you're going through treatments for something like egg freezing, definitely my classes are appropriate for you.
Yeah, I'm glad somebody asked that because honestly, I don't mean to not think about that, but I haven't thought of referring my patients who are doing egg freezing to your classes. I think there's a little bit of bias of like, oh, it's just this empowering choice and they're freezing their eggs and they're taking charge of their fertility and their career. But it actually, Egg
Still
freezing,
stressful.
Yeah.
It's still stressful.
Brings up a lot of emotions,
Yeah.
When am I going to be ready to have a child, if ever? Or, sometimes it's the first time people have ever been under treatment or had anesthesia. There's a lot of stress that comes with it.
Yeah, and they're facing some of the same challenges potentially as people who are planning to use those embryos right away. Like, what if they don't get very many, or what if they all fail testing, or, some of those same stressors are there.
Mm-hmm.
So,
absolutely. Yeah. Let's see. Anne asked, what about people who are having miscarriages or recurrent pregnancy loss? They are getting a positive pregnancy test, but is your class open to them?
Absolutely. And I would say probably every class I have at least a few people who've dealt with miscarriage or even repeat miscarriage, which is, of course, highly stressful. And all of the benefits of doing yoga for fertility support are also there for someone who's had pregnancy loss. So including helping to move grief through the system, because really we have to process that grief out before we try to move forward. But all the hormonal rebalancing, those kinds of things, and just the emotional support, all very important. I just recently did a class series that was specifically for people who had pregnancy loss or infant loss through the Return to Zero Hope organization. So I was leading yoga for fertility classes for their cohort, which were all people who had recently suffered losses.
I love Kylie Hanish and that program that she does, Return to Hope. It's an excellent program. You can look that up online. She's amazing. That's really great that you connected. Isn't the fertility community so small?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
Actually, I think I met her in your office when you did that get-together, whenever that was, some years ago.
Yeah.
I met Betsy Winter there.
Yeah. It is a small world. Okay, unfortunately, Lynn, you can't see every person in the world, right, to do your classes.
I've seen many of them, but
but how can people? They can see you online, but then sometimes people might want to find somebody close to them. How could they find a yoga teacher that is really focused on fertility, or certified yoga teacher? What would they look for?
Yeah, so the challenge is that general yoga teacher training doesn't talk about fertility at all. Even prenatal yoga teacher training doesn't talk about how to support people through fertility. So you really need to look for somebody who has training in yoga for fertility. And I have been running teacher training programs since 2014. Across the U.S., I've had students come from all over the U.S., from Europe, Asia, Latin America. So there are teachers out there who have been trained. So I would look for that in your area. And if you can't find someone then that's local, then definitely you're welcome into my online classes.
Beautiful.
And, I also offer on-demand classes. So if you can't attend at the hours when I am offering the scheduled classes, you can sign up to get the recordings of the classes and do them at your own time.
Oh, that's beautiful. Okay, I'm not being rude. I just picked up my phone because I wanted to read one of the DMs that came in. I just wanted to read it directly from her to you. Met my group of besties in Lynn's class. All 6 of us have children in so many different ways. Egg donor, sperm donor, so many IVFs, and adoption. When people ask how we met, we always say yoga. Isn't that beautiful? And it goes along with exactly what you were sharing with your story. How being open to different ways of building families, how your class turned into a support network, and now they are all still friends and spending time together. It's beautiful.
And I bet I know who that is, or I can guess. I can narrow it down anyway.
Narrow it to one of those 6. I love it. Yeah. Oh, Lynn, I just appreciate your being here today so much. How can we find you? How can we find your book?
You can find me on my website, yogaforfertility.net. My classes are listed there. My book is listed there. My book's also on Amazon. So Yoga and Fertility, A Journey to Health and Healing is the name of the book. And I would love to see you in my class, any of you.
Awesome. Thank you again, Lynn.
Thanks for having me, Lora.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I have truly enjoyed and learned from Lynn about the benefits of yoga and fertility for years, and I'm happy to share it with you. I love that she is a true pioneer in the benefits of yoga for fertility, that she has done the research and looked at it from a scientific standpoint as well as emotional and a healing standpoint. She is one of those unique people that really took her own experience, her own fertility journey, and continues to help others learn, connect, and heal on this incredible journey towards parenthood. You can find this episode and all others on my website, drlorashahine.com. You can find me and lots of content on all things fertility on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. I love educating. Please send us an email to hello@drlorashahine.com. Share your own fertility story, share topics you'd like us to cover, and anyone you'd like us to interview. Thank you so much to my producer, Shannon Perry, and her team at Audiotocracy. This is your host, Dr. Lora Shahine. See you next week when we talk about survival tips for the holidays with infertility and miscarriage. Until then, wishing you love, luck, and pineapples.